Despite the heavy snow falling on top of their heads, Qin Tian and Nick start stacking ice blocks to create their house. When Nick asks him if they are going to stay there for a while, Qin Tian informs her that they will probably just stay for a few days. However, seals are extremely vigilant, so they would need to still make some preparations. Aside from their own igloo, they could also build a big house for their reindeer, Horn. In response, Horn bleats his appreciation for their efforts. As the sky darkens above them, the snow continues to fall harder. Thankfully, they managed to finish the igloo before it got fully dark. After creating a fire, Nick wrapped herself up in her sleeping bag and went to sleep. Meanwhile, Qin Tian watches over her through the night. Although the snowstorm is heavy and there is little chance of polar bears coming out, they still need to stay vigilant. In the meantime, he can think about how to catch those seals. The next day brings forth a bright day, and wildlife fills the surroundings. Birds catch fish from the sea while the seals frolic in the snow. Nick wonders why, despite seeing so many prey before her, she doesn't feel excited. Instead, she stands in awe and feels that life in nature is so wonderful and diverse. She feels so calm and comfortable. Even so, they still must continue with their plans. They still are a part of nature after all. Qin Tian charges at the animals with his axe drawn and his skills in full effect. The speed bonus he gained in the past is still proving useful even now as he quickly dashes through the snow. He was getting closer and closer until the seal finally noticed him and cried out a warning. They all start moving towards the water, but fortunately for Qin Tian, they weren't moving fast, and he could easily catch up. However, they start diving into the waters in just a few seconds. Qin Tian was shocked, and even Nick asked him what happened. It turns out that the seals didn't even have to run to the waters. Instead, they gnaw through the thick blocks of ice underneath them and create holes in the ice. Even with their knives, it would take them too much time to dig through the half-meter block of ice. But the seals gnawed through them without any tools in just a few seconds. Normally, seals would resurface to breathe, but they are too frightened now, so they probably won't pop out anytime soon. In the meantime, Qin Tian calls over Horn to start their other plans. Horn could only carry a few things with him, and since they would need a lot of space to bring the seals back, they did not bring much food with them. Thus, they must catch some sea fish. Qin Tian creates a contraption with some sticks and branches, which he then lowers into the ice fishing hole. Nick inquires as to what the purpose of the branches might be, so Qin Tian explains to her that they are there to prevent the ice hole from freezing, while the middle part has a hook and bait to catch fishes. Since they still have daylight left, Qin Tian decides that they should search around some more, in the hopes that they might see other groups of seals. He also used this chance to teach Nick more about their surroundings. For example, an ice ridge is a long, narrow pile of broken ice that forms when two pieces of ice collide. Ice ridges lead straight to the sea, and seals are often seen on these ridges. Nick also asks him why they did not capture the walruses on the ice sheet when there's many of them. However, Qin Tian points out that the walruses were on the edge of the floating ice. There was no way they could catch them because they could easily jump or roll over into the sea. They should just focus on searching for ice ridges and hope that they have seals. After a while, Nick points to a nearby moving ice block and asks if that is an example of the ice ridge Qin Tian was talking about. They excitedly search the surroundings, but unfortunately, that ice ridge is a newly formed one. Its structure is still too unstable, so there will be no seals on it for now. Since they have walked for a long time, they decide to go back to their igloo and start anew tomorrow. Thanks to Nick's contraption, they managed to catch a pretty big fish that would be enough for them for at least 5 or 6 days. Qin Tian advises Nick to go eat and rest, while he thinks up new plans to catch the seals. The next day, they venture out again in the hopes of catching their prey. They could probably stay in the ice sheets indefinitely thanks to their animal furs and igloos as shelter. They can also hunt fish for food. However, Horn needs mosses and lichen for food. These are abundant in the snowfield, but none in the ice sheets. Although both places are heavily covered by snow, the snowfield still has soil underneath it where plants can grow, while there are only solid blocks of ice under the ice sheets. Thus, they can only probably stay here for 10 to 15 days before they must go back to feed Horn. Nick was concerned that the seals might not show because it was heavily snowing, and few animals usually go out. However, Qin Tian was confident. Last night, he spent 1,000 points to purchase the Ice Sheet Experience Pack, so he knows that seals would be in the ice sheets even under this weather. Thankfully, they finally managed to spot some seals after a while. This time, Qin Tian has a new plan, and he orders Nick to stay behind with Horn. To start hunting the seals, Qin Tian first laid out his animal furs on the ground. He then lies down on top of it and wraps it around himself. Using his feet, he slowly but surely pushes himself nearer to the seal. His hope was his low posture and slow movement would not spook the seal and scare it away. Thankfully, the seal just looks at him curiously. He learned this method from the Ice Sheet Experience Pack. and it looks like he's already getting back his money's worth. Even Nick, who was watching from afar, is amazed at his method, and she wonders if it's because Qin Tian currently looks like a seal himself. When Qin Tian is near enough to the seal, he abruptly stands up with his weapons drawn. The seal immediately tries to run away, but Qin Tian is already too close. He jumps into the seal just as the seal dives into a nearby ice hole. Qin Tian's spear follows the seal and stabs through its tail, staining the waters red with blood. He then pulls on the rope attached to the spear and flings the seal back into the ice. The seal is still alive and tries to run away, but Qin Tian quickly ends its struggles with his knife. Nick runs toward him, congratulating him for successfully hunting the seal. She was amazed at how fat the seal was, which Qin Tian was also glad to see. The fatter the seal is, the more it has for them to collect. He was worried that it wouldn't be fat enough. They then start dissecting the seal right on that very spot. After a few hours, they had moved the resources they got from the seal into a couple of large clay pots they brought from the sled. Thanks to the Ice Sheet Experience Pack, their seal hunting is succeeding. Now they must continue their success. The sun is at its apex, signifying that it's still noon, so the two split up and hunt seals on their own. Nick copies Qin Tian's method and starts pushing with her feet while lying down on the ice while wrapped in animal furs. She discovered that it was still so cold that she couldn't feel her fingers. Qin Tian did this method earlier in the morning when it was even colder, but he didn't quit, so Nick pushed herself to continue. Meanwhile, the seal she's targeting is just yawning in the open, oblivious to the human getting closer to it. After a few minutes, Nick jumps up near the seal and charges right at it. However, the seal was quicker than her and was able to dive into an ice hole before she could throw her spear. She laments how slow she is compared to Qin Tian, and she couldn't catch up to the seal at all. It looks like she must look for another method of hunting. Nick then decides that she's just going to do it her way. She'll be waiting by the ice hole, and if a seal swims near it or shows up, she'll pierce it with her spear. This might look like a dumb plan, but her stillness was so good that a seal slowly swims its way nearer to the ice hole. She then quickly pierces the seal and captures her prey. Later that night, she tells Qin Tian everything she experienced while hunting. Most of the seals were too timid, and even when she was able to get 30 or 40 meters near them, they all rushed into the ice holes and escaped. She then tells him how she waited by the ice hole. But after one whole afternoon of waiting, she only captured one seal. Qin Tian agrees that hunting seals isn't an easy job. However, they still managed to catch some of them. Compared to yesterday when they didn't get any, it was still an improvement. They then roasted some seal meat in the fire for dinner and went to sleep. On the fourth day, they once again captured a seal each. On the fifth day, their techniques are getting better, leading them to be able to capture 2 seals each. On the sixth day, only Nick managed to capture 1. But on the seventh day, they both didn't capture any. Qin Tian wonders if they might have hunted them too frequently, that the seals are now choosing to hide under the water or in icebergs farther in the sea. Nick agrees with his guess, since after all, seals are smart compared to other animals. Luckily, they still captured at least 10 seals in the last few days, which Nick surmised was enough for them to survive the harsh winter. Nick also points out that Horn is running out of food, so it might be wise if they go back to the snowfield. Qin Tian agrees with her suggestion, and they spend their last night in the ice sheet. During the night, Qin Tian notices that the wind outside seems to be quieter than usual. However, this is better for him, since without the noise, he could hear the movement outside more clearly. He then notices that something seems to be happening with their clay pots full of seal oil. Qin Tian carefully lifted the cover of the clay pot, and he found that the seal oil seemed to be shining like gold. This was good news for him. He quickly wakes up Nick, who finds the smell of the oil so good that she immediately gets up. A few minutes later, they are now eating some fish dipped in the oil. Nick found out that the oil seemed to be warming her up. Qin Tian explains to him that it looks like the solidified seal oil has melted and become shiny oil under the high temperature of the campfire. Nick also understood why Qin Tian was insistent they find the seals. In this frozen oil, eating the oil can effectively keep out the cold and maintain their body temperature. After eating their fill, Qin Tian invites Nick to go for a walk. Outside the igloo, they appreciate the beautiful night sky and full moon. Qin Tian also wonders how Yellen and the others are doing. The next day they start their trek back to their base. Qin Tian knows that if the sky is clear and cloudless at night, then the following day should be a clear day. The moon was so bright and there weren't many stars last night, so they should have no problems today with the weather. When the afternoon rolls around, Qin Tian suggests that they stop since they must build an igloo for the night. Qin Tian starts creating the foundation of the igloo while Nick handles creating the snow bricks. After a while, Qin Tian notices that Nick has stopped giving him new snow bricks. He asks her if she's doing fine, but Nick doesn't answer. He quickly heads over to the hole in the snow where Nick was cutting up the ice, and he finds her there with a solemn look on her face. He wonders if she found anything, but Nick reveals that she found seawater when she was cutting the snow bricks just now. She suddenly heard a sound under her feet. When she carefully listened to it, she realized that it was the sound of the tide ebbing. Nick was surprised by this since there is snow all around, so how could there be a sea under them? He goes down the hole and listens to the ground, and just like Nick had said, he also hears water splashing around. He immediately takes his knife and stabs it into the ice. Using that, he determined that the snow should be less than half a meter thick left. The two dug around until they finally hit the ice. They were amazed that they were still under the ice sheet even though they had already traveled more than a dozen kilometers today. Nevertheless, Qin Tian tells Nick that it seems the ice sheet wants to give them one last gift before they leave. Since they can hear the waves crashing across the ice block, then there should be a beach underneath them. He then decides that they should first finish the igloo before digging through the hole in the ice block and gathering their gift. At midnight, Qin Tian wakes Nick up and informs her that they are now going back to the ice hole. Inside, they should find their gift in the form of blue mussels. He expounds to her how blue mussels have meat that contains a variety of vitamins that the body needs. Although they had cloudberries to supplement their vitamin needs, they didn't have many of them, so it was a good thing they found another source of vitamins. Nick then asks him why they must wait until midnight to gather the blue mussels, when they had already finished creating the ice hole earlier. Qin Tian explains to her that when the full moon is in its apex, the tidal range will reach its maximum, so they would have plenty of time to move under the ice sheet. Just like he predicted, the water underneath the ice hole starts receding and reveals a sandy beach underneath. Without timing tools like clocks or watches, they can't know how much time has passed or calculate the ebb and flow of the tide. Thus, they can only rely on the sound of the waves and keep their ears sharp while gathering the mussels. The ice may also be thick above them, but there is still the possibility of collapse since there's no seawater underneath supporting its weight. If they hear ice shattering, they should escape while they can. Collecting blue mussels under the ice may look easy, but it is very risky. Most times there will be no danger, but if it occurs, it will surely be deadly. Thankfully, nothing bad happened, and they managed to return to their igloo with a bag heavy and full of blue mussels. Qin Tian estimates that they must have gathered more than 100 kilograms. Nick suggests they go pick some more since the tide hasn't risen yet. But Qin Tian decides against it. It has been low tide for so long, so the tide might rise any time now. They don't really need to take the risk, and they should just move the blue mussels to their sled. They also tried the blue mussels, and Nick found it extremely delicious. She could even eat a couple of them, while for Qin Tian, he thinks its raw wriggling form very unappetizing. In fact, raw meat seems to be more appetizing. However, he needs to eat them for the sake of vitamins. He slurps the mussel into his mouth, and he finds it to be like refrigerated jelly. It went smoothly into his mouth, and although the juice was still fishy, it tasted okay. With that done, Qin Tian suggests to Nick that they should go to sleep since they would have to travel early tomorrow. The weather has been nice for the last few days, so they should take advantage of that. After a lot of traveling, they finally reach their cabin in the woods. Unlike the ice sheets, there were trees and all kinds of animals here. One squirrel even drops a pine cone on Qin Tian. The two lay down on their bed, enjoying its softness after their long and hard journey. Qin Tian starts listing the things they need to do, like deal with the prey they gathered in the wild, make bows, or even arrows. Unfortunately, the comfort of their house seeps into his bones and he finds himself slowly drifting into sleep. A few days later, everything is back to normal with Qin Tian and Horn hunting for food, while Nick takes care of the household chores. Qin Tian returns after capturing 2 hares in their traps, while Nick finishes skinning the sealskin. Qin Tian suggests that they use sealskin to create waterproof shoes. Their shoes are often drenched by snow, making them wet and cold, so having waterproof ones would be helpful. Nick also reminds Qin Tian that he was planning to make bows and arrows. However, Qin Tian replies that it's not easy making bows powerful enough to murder seals. He would need to do more preparations, but he first needs to focus on the upcoming winter. When winter arrives, the two are stuck inside their cabin in front of a roaring fire. Qin Tian knew that it would be colder during the winter, but he never expected it to be so cold that they would be almost freezing. Since mid-November, it has been snowing almost every day, but thankfully they have stored enough food. Qin Tian decides that no matter how the weather is, he will never go out to hunt. However, staying at the cabin for weeks at a time became too boring for Qin Tian. They decide to go on walks outside. The snow makes the visibility poor, so they still just go around the cabin for the sake of safety. When it gets too cold, Qin Tian runs back home. Meanwhile, Nick remarks that Horn's food supply seems to be running low. They would have to seek some more in the coming days. Reindeer usually migrate to some warm places with rich food for winter. But since Horn is their pet, it couldn't migrate, so they are now responsible for taking care of him. They head back inside their cabin and warm themselves up after their cold trek outside. While eating some of their jam, Nick wonders how the others are doing this winter. Qin Tian assures him that they should be fine since the boat should be stocked with supplies and they have more people to work with. In fact, they could even have already arrived at their destination, Zone A1. They would eventually meet in the future, so they should just go to sleep and focus on surviving through this winter. Meanwhile, outside the cabin and under the night sky, nature is still doing its thing. A snow hare is peacefully rambling about in the snow when wolves suddenly appear all around it. The hare shakes in terror before these predators, but the wolves mercilessly hunt it down. The pack of wolves successfully hunted their food, but they also noticed something in their environment. In the distance, in a clearing in the forest, stood a couple of shelters. The wolf howls into the night and calls his pack as they prepare for another hunt. Inside their cabin, Nick and Qin Tian are sleeping peacefully while Horn is shaking in fear. He could smell the wolves just outside the door. The door slowly creaked open, and a wolf can be seen salivating over the tasty deer. Horn makes a lot of noise that thankfully woke Nick and Qin Tian up. They realize that something must be happening outside, and they hurriedly exit their cabin. What greeted them was a group of white wolves growling at them. Nick fiercely faces them while Qin Tian also activates all his gifts. With Flash Cat and Swift Cheetah, his speed increases, and with Tough Ox, his strength and durability heighten. Qin Tian then grabs one of the wolves by the throat and slams it into the ground. Meanwhile, Nick dodges a wolf's attack and kicks it in the head, knocking it out. But it wasn't over yet. Wolves jumped down from the roof of their cabin, and the two humans found themselves surrounded with nowhere to run. Qin Tian calls for a hasty retreat, and the two of them run back inside their cabin, leaving the wolves outside. They immediately close the doors just as the wolves slam into it, trying to get in. Qin Tian was annoyed at the wolves. He never hunted them while it was spring, so how dare they try to eat him now? They never discovered a trace of white wolves before, so where did they suddenly come from? Qin Tian pulls out his dual blades, while Nick hefts her large hammer. They must go outside and rescue Horn from the wolves. Meanwhile, the wolves keep trying to break into the cabin. The door shakes with a loud bang as they try to ram their bodies through, while Qin Tian asks Nick to close the cabin windows to prevent them from getting inside. From the window, Nick reports that they are badly surrounded while a wolf is already digging a hole outside the door of Horn's house, and it's almost halfway in. This angers Qin Tian, and he kicks the door out himself, destroying it and sending the debris hurtling towards the wolves. The wolves yelp in pain, but this doesn't deter Qin Tian from slashing and destroying them. Nick also jumps in front of Qin Tian and swings her gigantic hammer at the wolves, hurtling them back. In the distance, they can see the back of the wolf trying to tunnel its way into Horn's house. They run towards it while Horn is shaking in fear inside. The wolf was about to burst from the ground, but thankfully, Qin Tian managed to reach them in time and murder the wolf. They ask Horn if he's fine, and Horn happily bleats inside. With their pet's good health confirmed, the two armed humans focus on fighting the other wolves. There are still more of them surrounding them. Qin Tian observes that if they want to defeat the wolf pack, then they would have to eliminate the Wolf King. This should cause the others to panic and separate, allowing them to counterattack. However, all the wolves look almost the same, especially in the darkness of night. It's too difficult to find out which one is the Wolf King. He laments that his pet wolf, White Eye, wasn't with them. If he was, then this wolf pack would be a tremendous boon to them. Normally, there are two types of fights between wolves. First, there is a group fight, while another is a fight between wolf kings. Since White Eye was the leader of his own pack, if he could have defeated the Wolf King here, then they would have been able to get this wolf pack and their territory too. He could hear the Wolf King howling his orders, but there were so many he couldn't see which specific one was howling. The wolves then started attacking them, so they had no choice but to fight back each and every wolf attacker. Unbeknownst to Qin Tian, the Wolf King stalks behind the other wolves and abruptly pounces on Qin Tian. Qin Tian falls over backward and the other wolves immediately rush in and start biting him all over. Nick shouts out to Qin Tian and Qin Tian starts berserking, shaking off all the wolves on top of him. He then grabs the Wolf King by the throat and starts squeezing. He commends the Wolf King for using his followers to exhaust him first before attacking. However, he is also pissed off at how the Wolf King is just using his companions and not fighting by their side. He grabs the Wolf King by its tail and throws him into the other wolves. Surprisingly, the Wolf King stood back up despite his injuries. This surprises Qin Tian, so he uses his skills to appraise the wolf. It turns out that it's not just a normal white wolf king, but a dire wolf. Dire wolves are the largest canine in history, living in the Ice Age 400,000 years ago. Compared with today's wolves, a dire wolf's body and limbs are shorter and stronger. It has a terrible biting force and a durable body like a hyena. Qin Tian realizes that there must be prehistoric creatures in all the areas of this place. Nick stands in front of Qin Tian with her weapons out and asks him if he's okay. Despite his wounds still oozing blood, he smiles and assures her that he's fine. He warns Nick to keep herself safe, and he then walks toward the wolves. The wolves glared at Qin Tian and growled at him, but they had all stopped attacking. Nick wonders why they stopped, and Qin Tian guesses the wolves must be planning something, or starting to be more wary of them. One of the wolves abruptly howls into the air, and the others immediately turn around and run away from the two humans. Qin Tian was relieved to see them go because his wounds were causing him a lot of pain. If the wolf pack hadn't retreated, then he really didn't know how it would end up. After checking up on Horn, Nick helps him go back inside their cabin. She lays Qin Tian down on their bed and offers him a hot drink. She knows that he was badly injured, but she has no idea what to do. Thankfully, Qin Tian instructs her to first tie his thighs with animal tendons to stop the bleeding. Next, she should bandage the wounds on his shoulders with his shirt, not the hide. Qin Tian wasn't sure if his skill, Silver Wolf, would enhance his immunity, but he couldn't risk his wounds getting infected. He asks Nick to use her method to stop the bleeding. Nick was apprehensive, but she quickly took a burning wood from their campfire. She then lets Qin Tian bite on some cloth, and then uses the burning wood to cauterize his wounds. The wounds sizzled and closed under the intense heat, and the night air was filled with Qin Tian's cries of pain. The next day, Qin Tian was left on bed rest while Nick took care of him. She leaves to heat up some fish and smoked meat for him while Qin Tian tries to assess his physical condition. He could barely close his fist, and any movement he made sent a sharp pang of pain striking him. He has no strength at all, and it looks like he would have to stay still for the foreseeable future. Truthfully, he wanted to go out and destroy all the wolves. Due to them, they had suffered such great loss. He wonders if the cold was so brutal that the wolves were forced to leave their territory to look for food there. They couldn't get anything this time from their camp, but they might strike again. It would be bad if they came before he could finish recovering from his injuries. Nick returns with a bowl of food, and she helps Qin Tian feed himself. After a while, Qin Tian stands up and checks his surroundings. Strangely enough, he felt a warm sensation spreading around his wounds while he was eating. It must be his skill, Silver Wolf, working. He was surprised because his skill wasn't that strong in healing him when he was injured by the polar bear in the past. It must be because they now have plenty of food like fish and meat to help in his recovery. He gives Nick his empty bowl and asks for more meat to eat. A few hours later, Qin Tian wakes up again from his bed rest asking for Nick to bring him some food. Nick was surprised since Qin Tian had just eaten his large meal 2 hours ago. This also surprises Qin Tian, so he asks her to prepare more food since it looks like he may be hungry soon after his meals. Without meat, he became weak again. Luckily, they have stored enough food so they can eat without worries. Qin Tian eats the smoked meat Nick brought him, and as expected, the effect of his gift was enhanced. In other words, if he has enough energy, his gift Silver Wolf can be fully used. He was starving and feeling ill when they fought the polar bear, so he never noticed it before. In summary, his gift was like an engine, running slow or even stopping when he had insufficient power. In the past, his gift must have been using the energy inside him to cure his wounds, which was why he always felt weak and stumbled down on the ground a lot. When he got Silver Wolf, he thought the function of it didn't match the name, but after this incident, he finally understood why it had that name. With this speed of recovery, he might be able to regain his full health in under a month. He was sure that he could take down the Wolf King again the next time they met. Of course, he still needs to rest before all those things can happen. Meanwhile, outside, Nick buries the corpses of the wolves they murdered under the snow. She noticed that the wolf fur seemed to be good, so she decided to harvest them too. She moves the corpses in good condition into their warehouse, and she plans to deal with them when she has more time. However, she was surprised when she opened their warehouse. Nick immediately runs to Qin Tian and reports the bad news. All the meat in the warehouse had disappeared. The two put on their cloaks and investigated the warehouse. Behind some of their clay pots, they discover a tunnel under the ground leading outside. It seems that while they were fighting against the wolves, another group of wolves had dug a hole and stole their food. That would explain why the wolves were just encircling them but did not dare attack them. Obviously, the wolves knew that some of them would die if they attacked, so they chose to just do a trick instead. Now, it would be tough for them to get through winter. They did get 12 white wolf meat, which would support them for a while. The next sunny day, Qin Tian suggests that they go back to the lake again. Given the current situation, even the wolves can't find food in the woods. If they are having trouble, then the two humans would find it hard to hunt and trap animals too. They can only get something to eat in their fishery, but before they set off, they first must prepare their materials. 1 week later, they had finally finished fixing the door, prepared a stock of Horn's food, and even put a plan on the floor of Horn's cabin. They then attach Horn to their sled and start the journey towards the lake. Qin Tian was worried about the worsening weather, so after a while, Nick suggested they take a break. However, Qin Tian points out that the longer they stay outside, the bigger the chance they might run into danger. As such, they should just continue traveling. The earlier they get to the lake, the sooner they can come back. After walking for just 2 hours, the parts of their skin that are exposed already hurt so much because of the cold wind. Moreover, even though they are wearing thick animal fur clothes, their body still feels icy cold, and their toes are nearly numb. They are now forced to take a break. They stop, enter their sled, and start a small campfire using embers. They also try to eat something to warm up their bodies before moving on. Qin Tian also reminds Nick that they would have to listen to each other's breath when they go to sleep. They must make sure neither of them freezes to death without the other noticing. After their hazardous travel, they finally reach the lake. However, the lake was frozen. Qin Tian figures that he can set up the fish traps after he breaks the ice, but the injuries from the previous battle with the white wolves haven't healed yet, and he doesn't want to do any strenuous activities. Meanwhile, Nick found some animal fur nearby and showed it to Qin Tian. She guesses they are white wolves' fur, but they should have been gone for a long time. They continued looking around and found some strange pellets near a tree. Those were frozen dog excrement after it had grown some bacteria. They then checked the surroundings to make sure that it's safe before doing their tasks, and after a while, they only find a few more frozen excrements. It looks like the wolves tried to break the ice to catch fish but failed. So in the end, they just left and never came back. They were glad that they didn't have to go into another fight again, but Nick then noticed something strange on the ice. There seemed to be bubbles trapped just underneath the surface of the ice. Looking more closely at the bubbles, Qin Tian hypothesizes that they must be biogas bubbles. Biogas bubbles are formed in water due to the decaying leaves and branches. Bacteria in these decayed materials produce methane, which accumulates and forms these bubbles. Qin Tian warns Nick to step back and then stabs the ice. He then lights up the leaking gas with his lighter, creating a huge blaze of fire. Nick is amazed at how flammable the gases are, but Qin Tian warns her that it's not just flammable, but explosive too. After their discovery, they resume their original task of catching fish. Nick creates some holes in the ice while Qin Tian lowers their fish traps into the holes. Nick could spot the fish swimming just under the ice, and Qin Tian explains that it's because with the frozen surface of the lake, oxygen and food became extremely scarce for the fish. Thus, the fish will get attracted to parts where there are abundant oxygen reserves like ice caves. After a while, their fish traps get filled with fish and they transfer them to their clay pots. With the way things are going, Nick guesses that they could return home the next day. However, Qin Tian suggests that they should stay put for some time. He wants to deal with the wolves before they leave. They'll catch enough fish to last them the whole winter and then wait for the wolves to come to them by the lake. One night by the lake, Nick kept watch outside by the bonfire while Qin Tian was resting on the sled. Qin Tian feels something in the air, and he realizes that the wolves must be coming. He exits the sled and instructs Nick to wait for him at a specific spot. Nick leads Horn and their sled away while Qin Tian takes out a torch and lights it in their bonfire. He then walks toward the darkness into the lake until he reaches the spot he prepared earlier. The spot was full of dead fish they caught, and he stayed there waiting for the wolves. Meanwhile, the wolves are amassing in the nearby woods. With his torch held up high above his head, the wolf pack immediately spots Qin Tian in the middle of the frozen lake. As the wolves approach him, Qin Tian starts taunting them for being so slow. He holds a fish in front of him and dares them to attack. The wolves stop a few meters away from Qin Tian because they are still wary of what plan Qin Tian might have. He tries to bait them more by flinging the fresh fish directly at them, and this finally triggers the wolves. They all charge straight to Qin Tian while he, on the other hand, stabs his sword directly at the ice underneath him. After making a crack, Qin Tian drops some ember into the crack and covers it up with his hand. The flames underneath rapidly spread as the biogas bubbles trapped in the ice simultaneously combusted. Just as the wolves pounced on him, the ice couldn't handle the pressure anymore and it violently exploded upward, flinging the wolves in every direction and causing them to fall into the freezing waters below. Qin Tian approaches one of the swimming wolves and goads it to bite him. When its bite misses, he grabs the wolf by the head and dunks it into the water, drowning it. Even though the situation has changed and he has the advantage in the water, Qin Tian is still surrounded by the wolves. He couldn't defeat them all alone. One of the wolves tries to maul him, but an arrow hits it in the throat. The bow and arrow that Qin Tian made are now being used by Nick all the way from the lake's shore. Using her superior firepower, she shoots at the wolves in the water one by one, allowing Qin Tian to escape unscathed. The battle is finally over. After the battle, Qin Tian wraps himself in animal furs and tries to keep his temperature up. Getting wet in the freezing lake had caused him to sneeze all over the place. It would be bad if this worsens into a cold or fever. Although he was only soaked in the icy cold water for a few minutes, it being winter means that if it weren't for his strong physiques and gifts, he would have already been dead. Meanwhile, Nick heats up a cup of tea and gives him some to drink. Thankfully, the hot drink effectively warmed up his whole body. Qin Tian confesses to Nick that he has already been thinking about how to fight off the wolves ever since their last battle. The amount of food was not enough for all of them to survive the winter, which means after they finished the meat they stole, they would surely attack again. Originally, he was planning to set a trap, but after seeing the frozen pond and the biogas bubble, he thought of a better idea. Now, he is extremely happy that this problem is solved, and he doesn't have to worry about it anymore. Nick asks him if they should take the wolf meat back home, but Qin Tian suggests they instead throw them into the pond. That way, the fish could eat them. Dogs and wolves are from the same family, but their meat tastes very different. Dog meat tastes sweet, but wolf meat tastes sour and is not that good. It was sunny the next day, so they headed back home with all the food and fish they gathered. The weather changed during their travels, and they were pummeled by cold winds and heavy snow. Thankfully, they still safely reached their home even though it took them all day and night. Inside their warm cabin, Qin Tian asks Nick to take off her shoes so he can take care of her wounds. Meanwhile, Horn also settles in his own bed, and they all take their well-deserved rest. A month later, it is now February, and Qin Tian is getting extremely concerned about the unchanging weather. It was still snowing heavily with no signs of it stopping. Despite the dark surroundings, Nick calls him back inside since it's lunchtime, and she has finished roasting their fish. Ever since they drove the wolves away and returned from the lake, it has been snowing heavily every day. Thankfully, they have not been affected. They just stayed in their cabin and warmed themselves in front of the fire. In fact, it was quite an enjoyable way of life. However, Qin Tian wasn't expecting it to snow every day until February. He was hoping the weather would get warmer now, but in fact, they even experienced the polar day phenomenon half a month ago. Although it was dark outside, it was in fact daytime. Thus, they are stuck in their cabins for one more month. When March rolls around, the weather has finally changed and spring is starting. It stopped heavily snowing, but the ground is still full of snow and it's still cold. After more than a month of rest, and with the help of his gift Silverwolf, all of Qin Tian's injuries are now healed. The sunny day means they can start harvesting materials from the environment again. Nick packed up all their potter bowls and wooden skewers, and they brought Horn along. On this fateful day, the materials they are planning to harvest are sap. Qin Tian spots some birch trees in the forest, and he explains to Nick that these trees store nutrients in autumn. After winter, they absorb melted snow water and decompose the nutrients to form birch sap. When he first came to this snowy island, he wanted to collect some birch sap. Unfortunately, it wasn't the right time. The sap in the birch trees had been depleted, but now that it's spring, the trees should now be filled with rich sap. They created a cut in the birch tree with their knives and then stabbed the skewers inside the cut. The sap inside the tree trunk leaks out of the cut and follows the skewer into their waiting bowls. The bowls quickly got filled, and Qin Tian was glad that the sap was much more than before. Although technically, it would be better if they waited until the end of March to harvest the sap, because by then, it would be at its most abundant and nutritious period. They put skewers and bowls on each birch tree they could find. Afterward, they tested the sap. Nick could tell the sap smelled of wood, and Qin Tian was urging her to try it when Horn abruptly squeezed himself between them. He also liked the smell of the birch sap. Horn laps up the sap while Nick and Qin Tian drink from their own bowls. It was a bit sweet like honey water, but it also had a bitter aftertaste. Nevertheless, it tastes good for their starving palate. The sap also has a unique flavor of trees. It feels light when one just drinks it, but then it bursts in the throat and condenses. Nick could only describe the feeling as a flavor that lingers long. They decide to fill up a dozen more jars so they can drink the yummy sap whenever they want. Besides, Qin Tian also wants to use it for other purposes. When they return to their cabins, Qin Tian puts the birch sap in a pot with a cover and hangs it above the fire to boil it. When Nick asks him what he's doing, he explains that he wants to collect the yeast in the air. To avoid failure, he and Nick made 100 jars of boiled sap. That way he should at least get one successful product no matter how unlucky he is. After a month, they are now ready to see the results of their boiled sap. They open the jars one by one, and their nose gets assaulted by its stinky smell. The sap looks spoiled inside, meaning that the jar has failed. They open the other jars, but it looks like every jar failed to produce the desired results. Qin Tian is getting worried that he might have made a mistake in the process. After all, one must ensure that the sap is completely sterilized and sealed properly. Moreover, what if there is no yeast in the forest? Nick smiles and encourages him to open the others since they made 100 jars after all. After a few more failed jars, they finally opened one that seemed satisfactory. It smells good and the sap now has a creamy look. Normally, transparent vessels are used to capture yeast called Saccharomycetes. This is because, unlike other bacteria that float on the surface, Saccharomycetes often sink to the bottom. However, since they didn't have glass bottles, Qin Tian was forced to use pot jars. To see if they get the desired bacteria, they will have to pour the liquid out and check the bottom of the jars. After doing so, a paste-like product was left on the bottom of the jar. Qin Tian cries out in happiness that his experiment was a success. The substance in the bottom of the jar is called yeast paste, which contains yeast, a lot of impurities, and alcohol. After opening the 100 jars, only 4 of them had yeast inside. That was only a 4% success rate. Fortunately, this yeast should still be enough to make wine. He plans to make birch wine so that he can also use it as alcohol. That way, they would never have to cauterize their wounds again with fire to prevent getting infected wounds. The next step is to extract the yeast from the yeast paste and destroy all the harmful bacteria. First, they put the 4 jars in a large pot of water and boil them all together. After boiling for 15 minutes, they pour in the boiling water and put the jars aside to cool them down to room temperature. When they aren't hot anymore, they shake the jars and allow it to mix before setting it aside once more. This should separate the liquids inside into 3 layers. The top layer of liquid is alcohol, the middle layer is the yeast liquid, and the bottom layer is the impurity. They then pour out the alcohol so that they can reach the yeast liquid. Qin Tian was very cautious when doing this step because if the liquid he was pouring out turned into a different color, then that meant the liquid inside had mixed. He would have to stop immediately to avoid wasting the yeast liquid or polluting it by pouring out the impurities too. After separating the alcohol, he also poured out the yeast liquid and mixed it with the sterilized birch sap. Now, they must wait for the yeast to ferment it and turn it into wine. A month later, Qin Tian is soaking himself in a hot bath. Unfortunately, the water cools down so fast in the cold weather or otherwise, he would love to soak in it for a while longer. Since it's already been a month, he decides to check the progress of their wine. Making wine requires a certain temperature, so instead of leaving the wine in their warehouse, he placed the jars in the cabin. After all, they always keep the fire pit inside their cabin burning every day. He opens the jar, and its sweet aroma fills the cabin. The longer the wine is brewed, the better it tastes. It would normally take half a year to brew it to get such a good smell, but Qin Tian made it to get alcohol. He doesn't really care about the taste. Nevertheless, he didn't expect that after only a month of brewing, the jar of birch wine would have such a heavy fragrance. Nick also enters the cabin and asks him if the wine is ready. They pour the wine into 2 smaller cups for them to try and down it in one gulp. Nick exclaims in surprise at how good the wine is. For her, it tasted sweet and spicy, completely different from normal wine. She feels warm and comfortable after drinking it. Qin Tian remarks that it tastes better than normal wine. Just like fruit wine, it also has a slightly sweet taste followed by a burning sensation. It was hard to accurately describe its taste. In the past, he only drank a little wine when he was forced to go during barbecue parties or other special occasions. However, ever since being stranded on the island where there are few chances to drink, he always tried and found the wine to be extremely delicious. Nick pours some more into her cup, prompting Qin Tian to warn her not to drink too much. However, Nick continues drinking more and more, surprising Qin Tian with her high tolerance for liquor. Anyway, they don't have anything else important to do tonight, so they decide to just enjoy the wine. They fill their cups with wine and toast the night away. A few hours later, they have finished the jar of wine and Qin Tian is tucking Nick into her bed. He wanted to scold her for enjoying too much wine that night, but he decided that it was fine. He's with her so he can just take care of her. Nick pulls the blanket up and complains that she's feeling hot, but Qin Tian explains to her that it's just the effects of the wine. She'll be fine when it wears off. However, Nick stands up and decides to get water for herself. She was so drunk that she accidentally lost her footing and she fell over backward. Thankfully, Qin Tian was very aware of the possibility and caught Nick. He asks her if she's okay, but he's getting distracted. His face blushes as he notices that Nick's coat fell off her, and she was only wearing undergarments. Nick sees his face and grabs it with her own hands. Before he could even react, Nick suddenly kisses him, and they lie down on the ground together. The ice explodes in a huge explosion and it quickly melts, creating a flood of water. Thankfully, the water is contained in the ravine and flows, creating a river. The sun also shines brightly from the sky, melting all the snow from the surroundings. Spring has truly come. In the ground, new trees and plants are also starting to sprout. Sunlight streams inside Qin Tian's cabin, and he wakes up seeing the wonderful day. However, something is different. Nick is soundly sleeping beside him. He caresses her face, and she wakes up. Nick's face reddens as she remembers what happened last night. Nick buries her face into Qin Tian's chest and asks him if he regrets what happened last night. Qin Tian smiles and answers that he will never regret it. He had a drink last night, but he was still sober. Thus, they decide to take a bath to start their new day. A month later, early in May, Horn is now growing into a strong and powerful reindeer. He can now run so fast even though both Qin Tian and Nick are riding the sled. At their current speed, they would be able to reach the wetland in just 2 days. If they continue, they will also reach the snowy mountains in a few more. Nick asks him if he really believes they can find iron ore in the mountain. Qin Tian replies that he's not sure, but they must take the chance. Horn and their sled slice a path through the snow right toward the mountains. After just 4 days, they are already at the foot of the mountains. Nick wants to start finding the iron ore already, but Qin Tian reminds her that they aren't in a hurry. It's already getting dark, so it would be inconvenient to climb the mountains now. Instead, they should find a relatively flat place to spend the night. There is no vegetation in the mountains, and stones are everywhere. Qin Tian hoped that iron ore would exist among these rocks. Nevertheless, they can take their time. After a few days, they start exploring the rocky areas of the mountains. Nick spots a lot of stones protruding from the ground, but when she points it to Qin Tian tells her that it has no iron ore inside. Thanks to the gift Wild Minerals collections, Qin Tian can tell whether there is iron ore inside different rocks at just a glance. This saves them a lot of time in checking the surroundings. The Snow Mountain range is so big that even when they can exclude the areas without iron ore quickly, it will still take a lot of time to search through the surroundings. He's not even sure if there is iron ore on that mountain, but he needs to search the area no matter how long it might take. If they want to leave this snowy island, they will need to build a ship. However, shipbuilding requires iron. If they fail to find any metal here, he and Nick might have to stay here for the rest of their lives. After a while, Nick prompts him to sit and get some rest. They have already been searching for a week, so she's concerned about how stressed Qin Tian is getting. Qin Tian agrees with her and decides to go for a walk. Instead of searching for ore, they would just get some fresh air or set some traps to capture food. They head to a nearby forested area where the two start constructing traps on the ground. They finished quite fast, and it's still early, so Qin Tian suggests they just walk around. He remembers an adage that says, when you are looking for something, the more you want it, the less likely you are going to find it. Thus, maybe they will just stumble into the iron ore if they just wander around without actively searching for it. Suddenly, a howl reverberates through the forest. Horn bites Qin Tian's cloak in fear, but he doesn't run away. This earns him praise from the two for overcoming his trauma of being attacked by wolves. Meanwhile, Nick asks Qin Tian if the howl could be a polar bear. Qin Tian agrees with Nick's guess since he was very familiar with that sound from his past experiences with polar bears. The animal should not even be far from their location. They were looking for iron ores, not polar bears, but since polar bears are what they found, he was willing to take them. Nick and Qin Tian draw their weapons and rush towards the source of the howl. Another howl echoes around the forest, which makes Qin Tian wonder if there are wolves around the area. However, Nick thinks that the sound is a bit different from wolves. The polar bear then finally shows up and is running straight at them. Even though it was huge, Qin Tian orders Nick to stay behind and take care of Horn. It was time for him to get a new fur blanket. Unlike in their past fight with a polar bear way back when they were still on the ice sheet, Qin Tian is now prepared. He doesn't lack food and clothes, and he's also not ill. A polar bear was a measly foe for him, and was not even a threat. He activates his gift, Tough Ox, and grabs his weapons with renewed force. With the polar bear he's hunting now, he would probably be able to make a new mattress from all that fur. His old one was made with multiple hides, which feels too rough to move on due to the threads connecting them together. Qin Tian leaps into the air and descends on the polar bear with a vicious cross attack. The bear's blood spurts everywhere and it crashes into the snow. Nick was amazed at how strong Qin Tian is now. She asks him if there was a problem with the polar bear, and Qin Tian replies that the polar bear was already injured before it even attacked them. Looking at the polar bear's corpse before them, none of its injuries were caused by Qin Tian except for those found in its neck and abdomen. Looking more closely at it, Nick observes that the corpse has a lot of finger-sized bloody wounds. It was obviously hurt by different kinds of weapons. Qin Tian doesn't realize this, but when Nick mentions it, he immediately tells Nick that they must catch up with the people who inflicted those wounds on the bear and use the weapons. Thankfully, they can just follow the bloodstain left behind by the rampaging polar bear before it attacked them. However, they hadn't even left yet when they stopped in their tracks. A group of men wearing fur cloaks had arrived. One of the men steps forward and asks them which tribe they belong to. That's all the chapters available at the moment. Comment below if you'd like the next part. Thanks for watching.